Thank you very much for the introduction, and apologies to the audience. My internet is a little bit patchy, but I'm hoping it will hold up sufficiently to simply say it's a great pleasure to introduce this professional seminar. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Territory Politics and Governance, and the person who will be leading the seminar today is Dr. Madeleine Hatfield, who is editor and director of Yellowback, and amongst many professional roles, she is a journal manager for the Regional Studies Association, and she has kindly agreed to lead us through the discussion about choosing the right academic journal. So thank you again, Madeleine.
Thank you, Klaus, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Regional Studies Association for providing this opportunity for connection at this time of separation. Thank you all also for joining me today from around the world via my little office in sunny southeast England. Today I am going to talk about how to choose the best academic journal for your next high impact article. As you will no doubt be aware, having joined this webinar, there is increasing pressure on academics to publish their research at all of their career stages. At the same time, the number of academic journals grows each year, and so it can be very hard to know which to submit your manuscripts to. This webinar will very briefly discuss why it is important to try to make the right choice, the factors to think about when making that choice, and some tips for making the right decision the first time round. First of all, we'd really like to take a short poll, which should pop up on your screen soon. It'll just be there for a minute, so if you can check your answer. The question is, how many journal articles have you published before? So please select your answer so we can find out a little more about you. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is why choosing the right journal is important, and there are a number of reasons for this. Among those are so that you can meet any funder or assessment criteria that you might be subject to, and we'll come on to talk a little bit more about that later on. We'll also talk about why it's important to avoid wasting your time. I put "your" in brackets because it's also important to preserve the time of editors and referees, who are very often volunteers in the peer review process. But also it's important to be aware that the publishing process takes a long time from submission to publication, and it's not uncommon for that to take up to 18 months, even longer sometimes in the social sciences. So choosing the right journal can really help you to navigate that process and make the most of that time. It can also help you to reach the right readers, which in turn can help your articles have the most possible impact. And of course, the most important thing is that if you choose the right journal, you are more likely to get your paper accepted. The vast majority of submissions to journals are rejected. For example, for a high quality journal in the social sciences, we would probably expect about 80% of journal articles to be rejected. So choosing the right journal can really help to manage that process. Okay, next let's think about when to think about the best possible outlet for your research. And the short answer is really all the time. So in part, you need to think about this before you start writing, right from the very start of having an idea about what it is you would like to write about. You need to be thinking about what is the right outlet for your journal, for your article. And that's because that really needs to inform the whole process. So it needs to be part of the process while you are writing, and it needs to be part of the process in reviewing a final draft also. So what kinds of things can we consider? Well, as I mentioned before, one of the most important is to think about any funder mandates that you might be subject to. And I think it's useful maybe to think of this process as like a kind of funnel, really, a way of filtering down the thousands of possible options open to you by taking some of the really big picture issues at the top and then really narrowing down to try and find exactly the right outlet for you. So in terms of funder mandates, this is very important. Increasingly, research funders are showing you the are putting criteria in terms of how research outlets must be shared. So this includes the need often to publish articles so that they can be either green open access, which means they can be archived in an institutional repository, or sometimes they need to be gold open access. And the best way to find out about these things is to check any funder documentation that you have, to speak to any of your mentors or department heads, but also librarians are a really great source of information. That also follows for institutional and national assessments. So again, if you are subject to particular assessments either within your own institution in terms of tenure applications, for example, or you're subject to national framework assessments, either at the location that you are in at the moment or where you would like to go in the future, then you need to be aware of whether there are any restrictions on where you should be sharing your research. Open access, again, is a key part of this, and this may also come down to your personal preference in terms of how your research can be accessed. A lot of very high quality journals do remain hybrid journals, which means that open access usually has to be paid for, so you need access to some funding. But your librarian can also advise you if there are any agreements between your organisation and a publisher. One of the next things to think about is in terms of journal quality and metrics. Again, there are a number of different ways of assessing the quality of journals, and different subjects and different national rankings are available depending on your own context. Of course, the highest quality journals are often the most competitive. It can take the longest time to get published in them and is the most difficult to get published in them. Quality is not the only, impact factors are not the only measure of quality. And it's important to think about other metrics and also other priorities in terms of reaching the right audience. Not every article is going to be published in the top ranked journal in your field, and not every article should be published in those journals because there are lots of other great outlets also. You need to think too about the type of article that you would like to publish. So in many journals, a full research article is expected to be around at least 8,000 words. Sometimes longer. In other journals, you can publish shorter types of articles, which also can be a very useful way to get started and get some experience in writing journal articles. Also, we're thinking about the kind of contribution that article makes. Is it a full research article? Is it a methodology note? Is it a review article of some kind? Not all journals publish all kinds of manuscripts, so this is something that you should take into consideration too. Last but not least is who's going to read your article or who you would like to read your article. One of the key things to think about here really is in terms of your discipline and whether this is a contribution that speaks to a sub-part of your discipline, to the whole discipline, or perhaps it's something that is more interdisciplinary and you want to look for an appropriate outlet that might reach across, say, the divide between economics and geography. This also applies to whether the contribution is quite specialist and niche, or whether it's a general contribution. And that's not necessarily a reflection on a good or a bad article. A specialist contribution to a field can have just as much or even more impact than a very generalist contribution. It's about finding the right outlet for what it is that you want to say. So I'd like to take a minute now to share the results of our poll if we can. So if we can see, here we are, just to see a little bit more about you. So 37% of you, this would be your first publication. The majority of you, just 42%, have had 1 to 4 articles published. That's great. 5+ also an experienced audience of 20%. Thank you. I'm sure you'll have some great contributions to make also in the questions session. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Once you have narrowed down in terms of any funder restrictions, open access priorities that you need to think about, there are a few tips for choosing the right outlet, because you've probably still ended up with quite a large pool of journals that you could possibly publish in. So one of the key tips is really to think about the journals that you read and cite, and perhaps specifically the journals that you have read and cited in the article that you are looking for a home for. The key places to look are the introduction and also the conclusion and the reference list. If you find that the journal you were intending to submit to is not one that you have cited at all in the reference list, it's probably not the right outlet for you, or you need to go back to your draft and think, how can I make this article more suited to this particular outlet? It's usually quite easy to find the aims and scopes of a journal. They're all available online on the journal homepages, and it's worth taking a moment to read those and have a think about if your article really fits that remit. As I said before, the vast majority of articles are rejected from journals, but most of those are rejected because they are simply not the right fit with the journal that they've been submitted to. It's not about the quality, it's not about how they've been written. So it's really a good idea to spend time on this to avoid disappointment. You should also take a look and read recent articles from the journal that you're thinking of publishing in. And again, it's good to do this before you even start writing, because reading those articles can help to think about how your article should be framed. What are the expectations of that journal in terms of how you frame your article? How are articles normally structured? What's the way in which they frame their contribution to the field? And possibly most important is to talk to peers and any mentors that you have in your area. And that's because they will have experience of publishing in particular journals. They might be able to tell you how positive the process was, how long it took, whether they were pleased with the outcome. They might also be able to help you to think a little bit more objectively about whether it's the right outlet for what you are writing. I think it's also important to say that you should not be discouraged if you receive a negative response the first time around. It might be that you can submit another, more suitable article to the outlet you've chosen, or that you will find a perfectly good home for it in another journal elsewhere. I've put up here just a little bit more information about the Regional Studies Association journals, which you can read more about via the link at the bottom of the page. But I do this also as an example of how important it is to look at the individual aims and scope and content of a journal. So these journals are all owned or part owned by the same organisation within the same field, essentially, but they actually have extremely different remits and different interests and different ways of presenting information. So it's really important to look beyond the titles and take a look at manuscripts and make an informed choice, and therefore you're more likely to get the result that you want. I'd also like to wish you all very good luck in finding a home for your articles. As someone who works with researchers all the time who want to publish their research, I have a lot of respect for how much time and effort goes into drafting every manuscript and dealing with reviewer comments. So I'd like to wish you all good luck with that, and I think now hopefully we'll have some time to take some questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for the presentation and for also giving us, I think, some of the insights that you've learned working so closely with authors, journals, and learned societies. One of the questions that was submitted by a member of the audience was around the issue of preprints. And I wonder whether we could just start with that. What's your view about preprints in terms of where they lie within this sort of journal landscape?
Absolutely, thank you. It's a very interesting question. There are an increasing number of preprint opportunities or working paper opportunities. I think it's very important to check any policy that your intended journal might have on these. So journals always seek to publish original content. Now, generally, the input that you can get from publishing some kind of preprint or working paper is quite valuable. It's a form of peer review and can help to improve your work. But journals might have particular conditions in terms of ensuring either that is then taken down when an article is published. Some conference proceedings in particular, which is slightly different, but they have ISBN or ISSN numbers. And that means that they are understood as having been published to an extent. And so some journals will then not seek to publish an article that has come from those. So it's important to make sure you understand the nature of what kind of repository you might be submitting to, whether it's preprints, working papers, conference proceedings, and make sure that you are, as author, are retaining the copyright on that article to allow you then to submit to other journals. But it's very important, I think, in terms of, raises the important question also of researchers being aware of the different kinds of copyright, understanding copyright agreements. And that's something, again, that librarians would be able to advise on, or there's a lot of advice also online. Thank you for your question.
And I think the other thing, just to follow up, was that as part of that first question we had from an audience member, the other bit which is that preprints are eligible for the UK REF 2021 framework. Inevitably, there are a few caveats, but in general terms, preprints are a perfectly legitimate scientific output. Maddie, can I take you on to a second question we've had, which I think is a question that many PhD students ask, which is, should they target high-ranking journals in terms of that all-important first submission? Do you have a view about that?
And again, another important question. I think that it's important to go through some of the steps, such as I've outlined, in terms of thinking about whether those journals are the right outlet for your particular manuscript. If that is the case, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to publish in those journals. The quality bar is likely to be higher, and the process is possibly likely to take longer. So you may have, for example, more referee reports. The referees may be more demanding in terms of the contribution that the article is expected to make. As a PhD researcher, you have a great depth of research that you have got from your project, and in that sense, there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to publish in a high-ranking journal. But I think you need to be aware of what you are taking on, in that if you need to publish to meet particular deadlines, if it's part of your publishing your PhD by papers, for example, that process is going to take longer and is possibly going to be more critical. And you need to be prepared that it might not be a success this time around. And I think not be discouraged by that. You know, even the most seasoned academics will get their manuscripts rejected from the highest ranking journals in their field, or even not so high ranking journals in their field, because that is part of the nature of the process of peer review. So I think really doing your homework, getting some feedback on a manuscript would be really valuable in that sense, and also just steeling yourself a little bit. It's a very critical process, and you just need to be, don't think that because you didn't get into the top ranking journal in your field, that doesn't mean there's not a value in what you've written. It's about finding the right home for it, which might possibly sometimes be in a more subdisciplinary journal, where you might feel more supported. But again, I work on some high-ranking journals. We always try to be supportive and constructive in the feedback that we give to early career researchers, even if it's sending an email, unfortunately, saying, actually, we've desk rejected your manuscript because it's out of scope for this journal, but you might like to consider, we will always try to give a suggestion of an alternative possible outlet.
Thank you very much. I think that's very helpful. So another question that's just come in, which I think is one that, as an editor, I also hear a great deal of, which is this: how much support can an academic journal reasonably offer for a non-native English speaker as contributory author?
Yes, that's another very interesting question. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that perhaps in previous times, when submission rates to journals were much lower, it was easier for journals to offer more individual support directly. Now there are great editing services available, and some of the publishers do offer their own editing services, but those are paid for services. Unfortunately, for most journals, given the volume of submissions that come into journals, then it is very difficult for them to offer more support. And there is an expectation generally by both editors and referees that a manuscript will already be fairly easy to read when it comes in. But again, it would be worth talking to any colleagues about this and finding out which journals they've had a good experience with. So again, you just need to be aware that if a manuscript is submitted and the English is not as good, it is possible that that will affect its experience through peer review. And generally the journal, unfortunately, is not going to be able to help you with that at an early stage in the process.
Yes, no, thank you for that. The questions are coming flying in now. Here's another one, which I think is often a great worry for authors in terms of getting it right. Is there a good moment to ask about the status of your paper once it's been submitted to the journal? Because everybody worries about peer review and how long it will take, won't take. What's the etiquette in your opinion?
Yes, thank you. That is a good question. And we do receive a lot of queries. And at the moment, we're receiving even more queries, I think, because people are concerned about manuscripts getting sort of stuck in the peer review process. In an era of online submission databases, it is quite hard to lose a manuscript, for example. I think some people worry that manuscripts might get lost. But things that do happen is that reviewer reports do get delayed, and also editors have many demands on their time. So it's a process that generally in the first instance would take probably 3 months to get an initial review would be a reasonable time. I think inquiring before that time, that's in the social sciences anyway, would be quicker in the sciences, so that would be a shorter sort of turnaround time generally, I think. So I wouldn't generally inquire before that time. You can now often get feedback, a little bit of feedback anyway, from the databases. If you log into your author center, you can kind of see where your manuscript is, although it's not that informative because the stages are quite broad, and I think that probably doesn't give authors always the reassurance that they would like to have. But a politely worded email asking about the status of the paper is almost never unwelcome. If that arrives in the first few weeks of submission, I think sometimes that editors can feel a little bit rushed, which again, you don't want to rush consideration of your manuscript. So I wouldn't follow up straight away, but a polite inquiry and reminder is not unwelcome. Certainly we'll always try to respond to those on the journals that I work on.
No, that chimes with me as well. Another question, which I think is a really excellent one, is about you're a relatively inexperienced academic. You're trying to build up your portfolio of papers. Is it a good idea to potentially co-author with a more experienced academic in order to get you over the finishing line in terms of securing that all-important top-ranking journal publication?
I think that's a really interesting question. There are a number of things to think about when involving co-authors. I mean, one is there are guidelines now exactly on what constitutes a co-author and ensuring that people are given fair credit for their contribution. So if it is your research, you may be a little hesitant to bring in a co-author onto the process. And working with co-authors can bring its own challenges, of course. But I think that in general, that could be a very positive experience in being involved in a manuscript publication. I think you can learn a lot from seeing that process go through and from having someone else to share, for example, the challenge of responding to any referee comments or thinking what to do with the manuscript if it's rejected. So I think you need to weigh up the different options that are available to you. But if you have someone that you feel that you could work well with and who will respect your contribution to the proceedings, especially if you're an early career researcher, then I think that can be a positive learning experience for everyone, really, yes.
Yeah, no, again, that sort of chimes. And don't forget author ordering, which I always think is something worth talking about early on. Another question is around, what do you think about the value of things like ResearchGate, Academia EDU? Are there things that our listeners, our participants ought to be wary of? Or are there also advantages that they shouldn't hesitate to try and seek?
Yes, I think, again, this comes back to the question of both copyright and I think working papers. So if an article has already been published in a non-open access journal, you need to make sure that you are only archiving the versions of the article that you're allowed to archive. So some journals will allow you to publish either the author submitted manuscript before peer review, possibly sometimes the author accepted manuscript, so the version that is accepted for publication, but before it is produced to look like a journal article by the publisher. But all publishers and journals have their own rules, and generally you can check these now with the major publishers anyway. You can look up the journal. Most journal publishers, the big publishers anyway, have author services portals of some kind. So you can look there and have a look at what the rules are regarding the archiving of your own work. And generally in the social sciences, for example, there will be an embargo period before they can be put on a repository like academia.edu or Mendeley or ResearchGate. And again, if you're sharing working papers on those forums before publication, again, it's just important to be aware of any restrictions that might be on the journal that you would like to publish with, in terms of whether that breaches the idea of original content if they see it as already having been made available online. Generally, they will see those as a working paper, I think, but it's important to be aware of that. And you might be asked to take them down once you have submitted, or at the very least, once an article has then been published in a journal. So it's really, again, about understanding your copyright and using the resources available to you to find out exactly how those work. We appreciate that it is quite complicated. So again, a librarian is a good person to advise you. Publishers do sometimes issue takedown notices for breaches of copyright, because they do need to protect the published articles as well. But again, seeking advice and understanding the rules, it would be a valuable tool there. Thank you.
I think we should just warn our audience that we're happy to go a little bit past 12:30 if you are, just because the volume of questions is rather impressive. So I'm going to also try and combine some questions so we don't go on all day talking about journals. But I think it's a tribute to you. You're raising so many important germane issues. So let me combine two questions into one, which is this. Some of the participants have raised concerns about predatory journals. How do we know, what is a predatory journal, what is not? But on the other hand, if many colleagues have to benchmark their publications, and they will be told, we want you to publish in top ranking journals, even though there's a bit of diversity in terms of what fits into the top rank. Can you give us any tips or advice about avoiding the predators out there, but also just trying to think about that benchmarking and how it might work, perhaps internationally?
Thank you. Yes, those are two really important points. And the issue of predatory journals, for those who don't know the term as well, has been connected to the rise in open access publications, in which you can essentially pay to publish, in which case the general peer review quality checks may not be adhered to as they should be in order to guarantee the final quality of the work. DOAJ website, they publish a list of open access journals, and there are also lists available of so-called predatory journals. It is difficult, there have been some contentious debates about what qualifies as a predatory journal. Just because a journal is a new open access journal, for example, it shouldn't be considered predatory. But there are lists available. Beale's list is one of the most famous, probably, of predatory journals. And I mean, essentially, not to suggest that people wouldn't want to publish your research, because they always will do. But if you receive an email from someone offering to publish your work that comes out of the blue and you've never heard of the journal or the editor, then it's probably something to take with a pinch of salt, shall we say. And I think, again, talking to peers and colleagues can be a good way of finding out if this journal is reputable, if it's known. You could also look at the editorial boards to see if you know the people who are involved, although there have been cases of academics being added to editorial board lists without their knowledge in order to support the supposed reputation of what are understood as predatory journals. In terms of top ranked journals, this does vary a little bit in terms of what you were talking about. So there are subject lists in some countries. Internationally, in social sciences, the journal citation rankings are probably the main rankings that are used, but they're not the only ones. And they do provide a measure of sorts within your discipline, but I think it's important to recognise that it's not the only way of finding a good outlet for your research, because if everything went into the top ranked journals, then they would just be huge, or that, you know, there would be no differentiation within that. So there are lots of good outlets. That looking at the lists are generally available through Web of Science. You can look up, for example, your discipline and see which are the top ranked journals in your field. But it's important to remember that those rankings are a measure of the journals, and they are not necessarily a measure of how well read your individual paper will be within that. You know, finding the right outlet for your journal, for example, can be very important. If you have funding to publish open access, then you will probably find that your article is read more highly through that route, almost regardless of where it is published, just because it is much more accessible to people. So I think it's not something where there is one answer for what is the top ranked journal, in that there are lots and lots of different lists and different metrics and different ways of looking at it. And it's also important to take those with a pinch of salt in terms of finding the right outlet for your own work. But both really important questions. Thank you.
Another challenge for me now is to try and congregate 3 questions that I think actually all touch upon something quite similar, but really important, which is this. You've finished your PhD, you're looking to publish your work, and a number of people have asked, number one, what parts of the PhD are likely to be more publishable than others? Number two, is it a good idea to put some of that precious PhD work in particular into book chapters, or should I be really focusing on academic journals? And number three, is there an advantage to be had in publishing in disciplinary journals against interdisciplinary journals? So I think it's really it's a bundle of issues which revolve around where is the best place to put my work, and are some parts of my PhD more publishable than others?
Yes, thank you for all the questions. I can see them all scrolling by. Thank you, Klaus, for bringing some of those together for me. Again, I think, really this sums up the fact that why this is an important topic and why it's a challenging topic. So let me try to take those in order. In terms of the best parts of your PhD, there's a lot of pressure on researchers to publish multiple publications from a PhD, and so that can, I think, understandably lead researchers to be thinking about how can I divide this up. And in sort of a traditional tripartite division, you might try to get perhaps one paper about the methodology and maybe 2 about the findings. Again, I think it depends where you're trying to publish and what you want to achieve. If you want to go for a really high impact journal, you might need to put quite a lot of your material in there. You might need to be prepared to do that. Although, having said that, the best journal articles will often make quite a simple point, and rather than having the whole thing in there. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract in terms of what's the most valuable. I think that your PhD examiners and your mentors, advisors, supervisors might be able to help you think about what is the real contribution here of this PhD. You might also need to be prepared to write it in a completely different way. So a PhD is written, even publishing as a book, for example, from a PhD needs completely rewriting in order to fit a monograph format. So if you think about that in terms of journals, you've got a lot of rewriting to do. So I think being prepared essentially to go back to the beginning, I don't want to depress anyone, but being essentially prepared to take a step back from your PhD and actually rework it in terms of what is the main contribution. That may be different from what was the contribution in terms of putting it together as a thesis. I think publishing in books can be a good way to get experience of the publishing process. It can be a good way to get your research out there. It's generally less complicated in that the peer review process might often be handled by the editor of, say, an edited collection, and it tends to take less time and be a little bit less intensive in terms of the review process. Again, it depends on what assessment criteria you might be subject to. In some cases, book chapters are considered to be less highly valuable or less high impact, so you do need to be aware of that. Often it's possible to publish journal articles as books after a certain period of time. It's generally not possible to do it the other way around. If an article has been published as a book chapter, generally journal publishers will not want to republish that, just because the journals are seen in many ways as being at the forefront and they want the original research, whereas part of a book collection could be slightly different. Disciplinary and interdisciplinary differences, this again really depends on your individual circumstances. There are some schools of thought that suggest an interdisciplinary journal is perhaps, it may not be as highly ranked in your individual field, for example. So that's important to be aware of. But if that is your readership, if that is your audience, if you are doing something that is interdisciplinary, then that would be the right outlet for your research. So it's important to think about these things, and I think to talk to mentors and colleagues to also get their advice on your particular situation. Thanks for all the questions.
I'm going to suggest, Maddie, we take 2 more questions, because we won't be able to do them all. I'm really grateful to the incredible audience engagement, but let's just do 2 more if that's okay with you. Penultimate one, which is about, again, I think it's about this etiquette business, is how important is it, do you think, for authors to carefully craft a cover letter, to really set out to the journal editor, this is what my paper's about?
Yes, thank you. I know this is still a requirement for a lot of journals, and there's usually a space to add a covering letter to your submission, even when it's on an online database. I think this can be a good place to make the case for why you were sending your manuscript to this journal. So going back to the point that most papers are rejected because they are not in scope, this can be a point where you can say, this is why my journal is in scope. I think this is why my article, meets the aims and scope of this journal. It's also quite a good exercise for you to do, I think, to think about, how does my article meet this requirement? I wouldn't generally say that you need to write a great deal. I think this is not the same as in previous times where you might have sent off a manuscript in the post and had a nice letter at the start of it to say why you were sending it. So I think they can be brief. Editors have got a lot to read. So I think, 1 or 2 paragraphs, you don't need to repeat sort of who you are or where you're based. That's generally kind of all there for the editors to see. But, a couple of paragraphs on why you've sent the paper to that journal, I think also will help the editor to understand where you're coming from, what you think the contribution is, and also show that you've done your homework. And of the hundreds of papers that have been submitted to that journal, hundreds, thousands in that year, then you have taken some time to do some research, and I think it creates a good first impression.
Yes, no, that sounds to me very wise. I also think writing good cover notes when you revise your paper when you're in the journal system is also a good idea. Here's the final one, Maddie, which is about co-authoring. And a colleague has raised the important issue about, how do you order names? How do you have that conversation about the division of labour and how it is formally attributed in the paper?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. This is a very highly political issue, and publishers do have rules even about who is included on that list. So you need to have made a contribution to the manuscript to be on that list, to be considered as a co-author. This is, as Klaus mentioned earlier, I think it's a conversation that you need to have early on in a relationship with co-authors, and there are all sorts of ways of doing it. So, if you have done the majority of the research and you bring on another author, perhaps you would remain the first named author and they would be the second named author if they were, for example, helping you to write the manuscript rather than contributing to the research. Alphabetical order is one way that is often used to do this, but that's, that's fair to an extent. It is now also not uncommon for authors to add a footnote that will say all authors have contributed equally to this manuscript. And that is to ensure that that is clear regardless of the order that the names are in. But I think the most important thing is it's just something that you need to deal with really early on in the process. You don't want to get halfway through and then have a disagreement with your co-author about who is going to be the lead author. Yes, thank you for all the questions.
Thank you, Madeleine. That was a very diplomatic note to end on, because I know it does worry an awful lot of people. But can I formally thank you again for sparing us the time and giving your professional insights in this topic. Again, as I say, I think it's a tribute to the level of interest in the webinar that we've had so many questions, and I think we've tried to deal with as many as possible. And obviously to thank you, the participants, for listening and engaging with us. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities to continue the dialogue beyond this webinar. So again, my many, many thanks to you and to the audience members. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus.